right, good evening. It is 6:57. Welcome. We've got a handful of people already in the room, so thanks for being early. If you would, see if you could, we'll see if the chat is working. Make sure that it is set on your end as well to host and panelists. And then go ahead and say hello. Let us know what part of the country you're located in. Maybe if you're a parent, student, teacher, administrator, that would be great. We're going to get started here in about 2 minutes. So you can see this. Awesome. All right. So I can't see who that is from. Actually, it just says from, yeah, Colorado Springs, parent of 5. Love it. I'm not saying who that actually is, but welcome nonetheless. Thanks for being here. We got from Oklahoma. We got a teacher in the room as well. That's weird. It's not saying who it is. So let us know as well what school you're at. Now, Dr. Williams, are you running an ultra marathon soon? Is that what I hear?
Yeah, that's right. 1st of November, I've got a little race coming up.
Little 100 miler or 50 miler?
A little 50 miler.
Well, 50 miler, no big deal, no big deal. Nice, awesome. Oh, there it is. Okay, Julie Parks, Colorado Springs, welcome. Julie, we've got Samuel here, Gardner from Oklahoma. Welcome, Samuel. Claudia, Silver City, New Mexico. Claudia, welcome. Thanks for being here. Julie Park. Again, if you're just getting into the room, welcome. Thanks for being here tonight. We'll get started here in just about 2 minutes. Let us know as you're coming in what part of the country you are dialing in from this evening. That would be great. We will get started real soon. All right, we got Samuel Gardner is teaching poli-sci at the University of Central Oklahoma. Fantastic. Stephen Hart, welcome from Cincinnati, Ohio. Teaches classes at Cedarville University, very close CLT partner college. Angelina Gardner, Angelina, I know you. Welcome from Texas. Fantastic. We've got Joseph Cassell, a teacher at the Lyceum in South Euclid, Ohio. I do know that school, Joseph. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. Heather Bradford, parent and teacher from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome as well. All right, I've got 7:01, so I'm gonna go ahead and kick us off. We'll get going here. People are still coming into the room, but I want to just kind of kick us off, explain kind of what this is, why we're doing this, and then we will introduce you to the one and only Dr. Brian Williams, who's the Dean of Templeton Honors at Eastern University. So we've had this idea for some time. So the goal here is to kind of do a journey. It's going to take us some time. It's a big author bank. A journey through the CLT author bank. It's been our goal since we launched back in 2016 to put as many students as we can in front of kind of the very best of what has been thought and said. As an alternative to the PSAT, to the SAT, to the ACT, that really puts students, I think, generally in front of pretty meaningless texts. We want to do the opposite, put students in front of even Dante, Shakespeare, C.S. Lewis, Flannery O'Connor, St. Catherine of Siena. I'm going to do a quick screen share, show you the CLT website, and then show you the author bank, where all of these authors are coming from. And then we will do an introduction to Dr. Williams, and then we will get into Dante tonight. So, all right, I'm going to do a screen share. All right, so here we are. This is the CLT website. We're doing a whole website revamp here. It's going to be launching in the next few days. But this is the CLT author bank. So this is important. This is 2/3 of every test that we have. 2/3 of the authors of the source material come from this author bank here. And so as you look through this, I think a lot of these names are going to jump out to you right away. St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Jefferson, Pope John Paul II. Really different than what students are going to be seeing on an SAT or ACT. And the whole purpose behind this, we launched out of this kind of one idea that tests, especially high stakes tests like the SAT or PSAT or ACT, these tests ultimately really do have a big impact in driving curriculum, especially at the secondary level. And so our thought was, instead of putting students in front of the very boring or bland or sterile or meaningless text on the SAT and ACT, what if we put students in front of Bonhoeffer? Or what if we put students in front of Dante? Could that maybe change education? And it's been a lot of fun doing that. So we're going to be doing this every week. We really hope to kind of keep growing attendees here. We're going to be back next week with friends at Harding University going into Tolkien. So I know we got a lot of Lord of the Rings fans probably in the house tonight. But yeah, we're going to be doing tonight a Dante. So it's going to be a couple minutes here just on introduction. Then we'll turn it over to Dr. Williams. And then he's going to be teaching. I've had a chance before to listen to Dr. Williams teach. He is a Oxford PhD. He is a scholar on Dante. If you're doing the 100 days of Dante, as I am, you may have seen him teach already. I don't know how the man who does ultra marathons, he got assigned with doing the chapter on gluttony, but nonetheless, maybe it is a secret sin or something, running too many miles, can't stop himself. But Dr. Williams, thanks a ton for being with us tonight. This is exciting. The first in a long series, and I think this is a great way for us to kick off the series is going into to Dante. I also want to just kind of give a shout out. The Templeton Honors College at Eastern University has been a great kind of landing place for a lot of former CLT test takers over the years. I've heard great things. They actually start off their 4 years with Dr. Williams at the Honors College with doing a 5-day kind of backpacking hike through the mountains of New York, I believe. It's an incredible program, what they're doing. They're really deep diving into this tradition with really some of the best professors I think that you would be able to find anywhere. So stay on this afterwards. I think at about 7:50, maybe 8 o'clock, we'll have some time to talk with Dr. Williams as well about what they're doing at Templeton, what the Honors College there is kind of all about. But without further ado, Dr. Williams, thanks so much for being with us tonight. I will turn it over to you, the master, and we will dig into Dante.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. Really grateful to be here. I'm going to start sharing my screen, folks, because Dante gives us so many images to work with. I would hate to talk about him without images. So let me share my screen, see if I can get it to come up here okay. And then we will move forward. Just a second to sort things out on my end, and then there we go. Hopefully you'll be able to see me still. Yeah, so thank you. Really excited to be here. Excited to lead the first dive into the author's bank, and super excited to be able to do it with Dante's comedy. As Jeremy said, I'm Brian Williams, and I'm at the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University. So, in what really little time I have tonight, if you think about trying to introduce the comedy in, 30 minutes or 40 minutes, it's a little bit of an insurmountable task. So, in what time I have, I hope to orient you to the author very briefly, offer some ways of thinking about the work as a whole, explain how it's structured, and identify some key themes and key features that I hope will help you be able to read the comedy on your own. I mean, in my estimation, it's probably the greatest piece of literature ever written, and at least the greatest piece of literature written in the Christian tradition. You may have read it before. You may be following along with 100 Days of Dante. You may have memorized it in the Italian. I don't know. But every time we come to the comedy, it's a new and fresh read because it is such a complex work of art and because we are different people each time. So on the screen in front of you, you have a picture of Dante, the poet, presenting his comedy to Florence. You'll see hell on one side, you'll see Mount Purgatory behind him, and you'll see the spheres of heaven towering above him. Just as an aside, it might be helpful to know that Dante called it a comedy because it begins poorly in that our central character, known as Dante, we call him Dante the Pilgrim. Dante the Pilgrim is in hell, but it ends well with him beholding the beatific vision of the triune God in paradise. Not a bad way to spend a few days around Easter 1300 when the story is set. And the word divine was not original with Dante. It was called the Divine Comedy after he died. He simply called it La Commedia, the comedy. Now, it's interesting that this picture, this painting, which is in the Duomo or the cathedral in Florence, shows Dante presenting his poem outside the city walls of Florence, because though Florence was the city into which he was born in 1265, in 1302, Dante was banished from the city. He was tried in absentia and convicted of crimes he didn't commit, which were trumped up by an opposing political party. But it meant that he spent the rest of his life until 1321 in exile, largely in Verona and Ravenna, where he was eventually buried. And you can see some statues down below there from Ravenna, from Siena, from Verona. And one thing I'll just draw your attention to in the upper right corner, that sculpture that we know from Auguste Rodin called The Thinker. It's actually Dante contemplating the souls of the damned as they walk through the gates into hell. Rodin was fascinated with the comedy and made hundreds of models from scenes and characters in the comedy. Now, that'll be interesting to try to help us think about the comedy in relation to the larger tradition. Now, I usually go to Charles Williams when I think about how Dante relates to the tradition that came before him. Charles Williams, one of C.S. Lewis's best friends and a Dante scholar. You may know that Dante was probably the author that influenced C.S. Lewis more than anyone else. But in his fascinating book of church history, Charles Williams describes two different ways that the church has done church over the centuries. One of them he calls the via negativa, and this is denying all things to the glory of God. And for him, it's St. Francis and the monastic tradition that represents that way. The other way is the via affirmativa, which is affirming all things to the glory of God. And no surprise, it's Dante that represents or embodies that way of doing church for Charles Williams, the way of affirming all things to the glory of God. It's the way of Christian classical education, or what's sometimes called Christian humanism. The belief for Dante was that because God permeates the entire cosmos and was at work even in pagan poets and pagan philosophers who were created in his image, God could either reveal things to them or through them that were true and good and beautiful and holy. So Dante thinks that every person, every poet, every image, anything that was really created before 1300 or 1302 when he gets banished, or 1308 when he starts writing, any of that is fair game for incorporating into the comedy and seeing all of that as a possible means through which God could reveal truth to us or draw us to God's self. That's obviously kind of exemplified in his use of the pagan poet Virgil, author, of course, of the Aeneid, whose own Aeneas makes a journey into Hades. Here, Dante really takes his cue from some early Christian theologians, especially in North Africa, who, like Dante later, recognized that the pagan poets and philosophers like Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and eventually Virgil himself could be conduits of, again, truth, goodness, beauty, and holiness. Virgil in particular was regarded by the early church as a non-Christian prophet, because in his fourth eclogue, he records what looks like a prophecy of the coming Messiah. So he was highly regarded in the early church, but he does represent this larger method for Dante of affirming all things to the glory of God. Now, Dante has two other guides. If you know the story, of course, there's Beatrice Portinari, a Florentine woman that Dante knew. And like other poets in the courtly love tradition, the kind of French troubadours, which was Dante's tradition, Dante idealizes Beatrice as this kind of ideal woman who draws him on. She becomes for him the embodiment of virtue and grace and, in a way, divine revelation. So if Virgil perhaps represents unaided human reason and what it could do, Beatrice in a way represents God's revelation and God's grace. His final guide on the far right there, little bald guy, that's Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a mystical theologian who lived and wrote shortly before Dante. And if Virgil represents unaided human reason and Beatrice represents divine revelation, Saint Bernard represents mystical union or contemplation with God. And he's the one that guides, like a pedagogue, guides Dante to the final beatific vision of the triune God. Now, who else is in the comedy? If you haven't read it, might be a fair question. Well, to qualify for inclusion in the comedy, you really only needed to have lived, died, or be written about by Easter week 1300, which is the setting of the story. You didn't even need to be an actual person, because the poem contains centaurs and Ulysses and Minos and Achilles and Kerberos and Aeneas and Dido, Helen of Troy, as well as Homer, Aristotle, Peter, James, and John, Brutus and Cassius, the Empress Justinian, and members of Dante's own family and a cluster of local politicians, poets, and artists. So what the poem does, it really nicely balances this universal, really cosmic, but this universal scope, as well as a very particular scope. So numerous characters in this story are known to all of us. They're historical persons, they're significant literary persons, but they're also all kinds of persons completely unique to Dante's own story, to Dante's journey, to Dante's family. It always raises the question, if the story were written about me, or if I was writing the story of my own journey, well, who would I meet? Who would be my guide? When C.S. Lewis writes his version of the comedy called The Great Divorce, he's got George MacDonald come down from the mountains and guide him ostensibly back up to paradise. So what we have here is it's a universal story that is applicable to kind of the everyman, but it's also a very particular story of this one person. Unusual in the history of literature for an author to make themselves the central character. I mean, it's something that Shakespeare never does. He doesn't write plays about Shakespeare. Virgil doesn't have Virgil as a central character, or even any character in the Aeneid. But in this way, I kind of think Dante invites us to identify with him in this personal way and see this story as not only his, but also ours. So how should we read the comedy? Well, it's pretty clear that I think Dante wants us to read it as a piece of Christian wisdom literature. Yes, it's an incredible work of art. It's a mind-boggling work of art. It's a beautiful work of art. But it's also a piece of Christian wisdom literature that he hopes actually forms his readers in what Augustine called in multiple places the ordo amoris, the order of love. You can see that on your screen here from the City of God 15, where Augustine says, it seems to me that it is virtue to say that it's a good definition of virtue. I think I left out a couple words, is that virtue is the order of love. And in De Doctrina, he says the person who lives a just and holy life is a person who has ordered his love. And in a sermon to his congregants, he says, I'm not saying you shouldn't have any loves. I just want your loves to be properly ordered. So this idea of the ordo amoris is this prioritizing of the good things that we are drawn towards, so that we are not excessively drawn to some or deficiently drawn to others. And so what the comedy does, it embodies virtues, it embodies vices as forms of ordered and disordered love. And along the way, Dante hopes, I think, that our own loves will be ordered and that we will cultivate virtue by, in part, learning in Aristotle's words to feel pleasure and pain at the right things in the right way and for the right reasons. Now, if you know the Odyssey, you'll know that you can kind of tell who the good guys are and the bad guys are from whether they demonstrate or violate hospitality, Xenia. In the comedy, it's really whether characters have properly ordered their loves, or at least attempting to order the loves. So that's how I think we should engage the poem, and I think it's how Dante himself wants us to read the poem. So let's move into a bit of the poem itself, this wonderful work of art that Dante here is presenting to the city of Florence. And let's start with, of course, the Inferno. Now, here's the structure of the Inferno. And you can look this up later. You can print copies of this and tuck it into your copies. But what we'll see is that each of the three structures, or each of the three spheres, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, have 9 divisions of them. Because Dante thinks that the triune God permeates the cosmos, and the triune God is represented by the number 3. The numbers 3, 6, and 9 are woven not only into the content of the poem, but into the very structure of the poem and the structure of the cosmos that he describes here. Now, one caveat, it's important to remember that Dante doesn't actually think hell and purgatory are structured like this. He is embodying or physicalizing sins as a way to help us see the true nature of sin and the categories of sin and the way they disfigure the human person and disorder our lives. So he's really appealing to our moral imaginations. Now, the 3 big structures of the Inferno here are based in part on Dante's understanding of the 3 defining features of a human person and how those defining features were given to us as part of our image of God. So for Dante, the human person is a moral agent. We are willful. We have a will that should be exercised through drawing our will into alignment with God's will. So we're willful. We are reasonable. We are given reason to know and to understand truth, to create beauty, and to work on behalf of the good of society. So for Dante, we have wills, we have intellects, and we are relational creatures made in the image of a relational triune God. And so we ought to manifest that relationality through love. Now, for Dante, those sins that most fully distort that human nature, that most fully distort the image of God within us, are punished lower in hell. These are sins that take us away from God, take us further away from God, and represent a greater perversion of our human nature. So if you look at the 3 parts of hell here that are on your screen, you see the very top represent the sins of incontinence. These are the sins that are simply a lack of self-control, a failure to use one's will to restrain the appetites of one's body. Down below that, you have the violent, who use their will and their body, but to do violence. There we go. There are the incontinent, the lustful, the gluttonous, the avaricious, the prodigal, the wrathful, and the sullen, the ascetic, if you will. The violent, those who use their bodies and their wills to do harm to their neighbors, to themselves, and to God. Down below that, you have 2 categories for the fraudulent. These are people who use their intellect and their will to deceive other people. So it's not just failure to control my appetite. It's not just the exercise of my body against other people. Now it's using my mind specifically to deceive other people. In this category called ordinary fraud, we find the people who deceived just kind of the man in the street, people that didn't have any other reason to believe them or trust them other than it was just another human being. Down below that, what's called treacherous fraud. Here, we see people who use their reason to deceive people who should have been able to trust them above anybody else. So people who deceived their family, people who deceived their members of their own political party or their country, people who deceived their guests, and worst of all, people who deceived their benefactors or people who took special care to give them something. And in the very center of hell, we find Lucifer, of course, who betrayed his benefactor, God the Father. Now, that's the structure of hell. So as you move through it, as you read it, or as you read it again, hopefully that was kind of a roadmap for where you're going. Now, let's move to the very first canto, which is kind of the porch or the entry to the structure as a whole. As we go through the 3 canticles of the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, we'll try to stop along the way and have us do a little bit of reading, especially for those of you who are actually going to take the CLT tests, and hopefully there are people on here who are planning to do that very soon. And this will help you, when you see a passage from the comedy on the test, maybe have a better grasp on how to read it well. So here's the opening lines of the entire comedy, and let me read them and then point out a couple things that will orient us to what Dante is doing. So he says, midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in some dark woods, for I had wandered off from the straight path. How hard it is to tell what it was like, this wood of wilderness, savage and stubborn. The thought of it brings back all my old fears. A bitter place. Death could scarce be bitterer. But if I would show the good that came of it, I must talk about things other than the good. How I entered there, I cannot truly say. I had become so sleepy at the moment when I first strayed, leaving the path of truth. That night I spent in deepest desperation. Now, just a couple observations, things I've italicized there that are worth noting. If you haven't read the comedy, notice he says midway along the journey of our life. Not midway along the journey of my life, not midway along the journey of his life, but midway along the journey of our life. Dante sets the poem in 1300 when he himself was 35 years old, which is half of 70, which has been the kind of expected lifespan of humans for a very long time, and comes from a passage in the Psalms. But he says it's midway along the journey of our life, in a way inviting us to see that, hey, this is not only my story, this is also your story. And then he describes something that you don't have to live very long to experience, and probably anybody who's slightly older on here has experienced this exact same thing, where he says, I woke to find myself in some dark woods, for I'd wandered off the path. And down below, you'll notice he says, I'd become so sleepy at the moment when I first strayed. I'm not even sure when it happened. You get the sense that Dante didn't, take great leaps and bounds from maybe his original starting point of kind of, moral and spiritual well-being to some wayward kind of place. It's more like he just got sleepy and distracted and maybe took a little step. Well, then the next step, that's only one more little step. And then a little step and a little step and a little step. And all of a sudden, he's 20 feet off the path, or he's 50 feet off the path, or he's 6 miles off the path. He's not sure how he got there. And then he wakes up and he thinks, how did I get here? I didn't make any huge, great moral leaps or failures. This whole series of small strayings and small distractions. And again, if you've lived very long, you probably are able to identify with that. And I think that's what Dante wants us to do. But he woke up, right? The danger, the real fear is that we might not wake up at all, like the souls in the Inferno. I mean, the only difference between the souls of the Inferno and those in Purgatorio and Paradiso are that the ones in Purgatorio and Paradiso woke up. They're all sinners. They're sinners in all 3 canticles of the comedy. It's just that the ones in the Inferno never repented of their sin, right? So Dante here is inviting us to identify with his waywardness, but also I think he hopes identify with his moment of waking up and saying, oh, what do I do now? So Dante in the story, he tries to leave the dark wood of error. He sees this mountaintop that he wants to, that he thinks he might need to go to, but his way is blocked by these 3 creatures, the Lanza, the Leone, and the Lupa, the lion, the leopard, and a she-wolf, who represent probably the 3 categories of the Inferno that I just pointed out to you. Now, they don't actually attack him like in that top picture, but it's a little more dramatic than what actually happens in the story. But he realizes that he can't get around these 3 creatures that represent his own sin, so he needs help. And this is where, in William Blake's etching in the lower left, I guess Virgil comes flying out of the sky, or he comes stage right in those other 2 pieces. And we discover that Virgil has been sent directly by Beatrice, who saw that Dante was in trouble, but Beatrice had been prodded by St. Lucia, and St. Lucia had been prodded by Mary, the mother of Jesus. These 3 women, notice the 3, but 3 women who were involved in Dante's rescue. And Beatrice comes to the poet that she knew Dante would listen to, which is Virgil, the author of the Aeneid. And Virgil then helps him. And as he says here, I won't read it all, but it's a great line where Virgil at the top there says, I think it best you follow me for your own good. And he says, I'm going to take you to, basically, I'm going to take you through the Inferno into hell. I'm going to take you up Mount Purgatory, where you will see those who rejoice while they are burning, until we are prepared, or you are prepared, to join the company of the blessed. And so then Virgil leads him on through the great gates of the Inferno. Now, let me stop before we move into the Inferno directly and just point out some of the big themes that we see all the way through the Inferno. I think there's probably 4. I don't know, I might rearrange these or come up with different words for these. One is certainly pride. The souls of the Inferno, like I said, are unrepentant. They are arrogant and they make excuses for themselves. Stasis, in that there's no progress made by anybody in the Inferno. There's lots of activity, there's lots of movement, but nobody makes any progress. And so they're stuck in this state of suffering for all eternity. Disdain, this is disdain for others, sometimes in outright hatred, sometimes anger, sometimes fury, sometimes just absolute indifference to the human person stuck in a hole with them. And then corruption. As we see the sinners who are in hell, we see their humanity corrupted in an increasing way the further we go down. So just an illustration, a small passage here that shows us how people landed themselves in hell. There's this, as they're walking up to the river Styx to see the boatman Charon, Dante writes that all those souls there, naked in despair, were cursing God, cursing their mother and father, the human race, and the time, the place, the seat of their beginning, and their day of birth. Now, you might note what they're not cursing: themselves. They're not cursing their decisions. They're not cursing their weaknesses. They're not cursing their disordered loves. They're cursing anybody and everything else that they think is at fault somehow for them being stuck in this place. Again, it's people who never woke up to the dark wood of error that they themselves had got lost in at one point in time. Now, let's dip into a very famous conversation in The Lustful, and it's one of the most famous conversations in the comedy. But if you haven't read it before, it really illustrates a lot of the characters and the interactions that Dante has with sinners in the Inferno. This is Canto 5 with The Lustful, where in Virgil's words, we find those who make reason slave to appetite. Virgil describes everybody in hell as souls who have lost the good of reason. And it's here souls who have surrendered reason to their erotic appetite. Lots of illustrations of Paolo and Francesca. On the left there, I'm just going to point it out again, a sculpture by Rodin, which is often called The Kiss and looks really romantic, except it's Paolo and Francesca executing the kiss that got them stuck in hell for all eternity. So sorry to blow that, beautiful romantic image of for anyone. But let me read this. And again, I've bolded some of the bolded some of the important lines here, and I for some reason can't see. Oops, I can't see the very bottom line because of the way Zoom is working here. But you'll get the idea. And note how this initial conversation between Dante and Francesca, it looks like it sounds like a seduction scene in and of itself, like almost like Dante is seducing Francesca to come to him. He says, "Oh, wearied souls, come speak with us if it be not forbidden. As doves called by desire to return to their sweet nest with wings outstretched and poised, float downward through the air, guided by their will. So these two left the flock where Dido is and came toward us through the malignant air. Such was the tender power of my call. She, oh, living creature, gracious and so kind, who make your way here through this dingy air to visit us who stain the world with our blood, whatever pleases you to hear or speak, we will hear and we will speak about with you." And so she comes down to Dante and he asks her what landed them there. And note her reply to Dante. Note whose fault it is that Paolo and Francesca are there. Now, I'll point out, because I didn't a second ago, Paolo and Francesca were brother and sister-in-law. Francesca was married to Paolo's brother, a hunchback that she didn't love, and she fell in love with Paolo, and they had this adulterous and technically incestuous affair that landed them both here. And so he is asking, "Oh, these beautiful lovers, how did you end up here in hell?" And she explains, "Love, that kindles quick in the gentle heart, seized this one for the beauty of my body torn from me. How it happened still offends me. They were killed by her husband, by the way. Then she says, love that excuses no one loved from loving seized me so strongly with delight in him that, as you see, he never leaves my side. Love led us straight to sudden death together. So notice whose fault it is that Paolo and Francesca are there. Not their own. It's love's fault. And who can resist love, right? Love kindled quick in his heart, seized him for me. Love excuses no one from loving, seized me. Love led us straight to sudden death together. And you realize that it might be that hell is full of unreliable narrators who they tell their own stories, but you can't always trust them, you can't trust what they tell you at face value. Now, Dante is a love poet. Dante is quite disturbed by this. And so he says, well, how did this happen? And you find out that Paolo and Francesca, she says, one afternoon, just to pass the time, we were reading the story of the adulterous love affair of Guinevere and Lancelot. So you think, oh, in the back garden, you and your, hot Italian brother-in-law were just to pass the time reading this famous adulterous love affair of Guinevere and Lancelot. And notice again who she blames for what happened. Time and again, our eyes were brought together by the book we read. Our faces flushed and paled, and to the moment of one line alone, we yielded. It was when we read about those longed-for lips now being kissed by such a famous lover that this one then kissed my mouth and trembled as he did. Now, if you know the story, you know it's actually Guinevere that kisses Lancelot first. So here we might have an instance of Francesca throwing Paolo under the bus when actually it might have been Francesca following Guinevere's lead, and she might be the one who had kissed Paolo first. But then in one of the great euphemisms in all of literature, she says, the book and its author was our Galahad, and that day we read no further. They read no further because they got on to more amorous activities. And then Dante responds and he says, all the while that one of the two spirits spoke these words, the other wept in a way that pity blurred my senses, and I swooned as though to die and fell to hell's floor as one dead. So here's a great example of the unreliable narrator of the characters in hell who blame everybody else. Here she blames love, here she blames the book, and in a sense, she blames her lover for her plight in hell. We see her actual sin kind of being played out, where she's very willing to be, if you will, wooed by Dante down to speak with him. And we get a picture of Dante, the pilgrim, as we often call him, and the fact that he's not yet quite learned how to properly respond to sin. He's not very far out of the dark wood of error. And so here when he sees these beautiful lovers in hell, he faints. In a way, he loses the good of reason, just like they had. Now, we meet more and more of these characters as we descend through the Inferno, but that probably give you a picture and set you up for any of the other encounters that you read, that we can't necessarily trust those who are in the Inferno, but we know what to expect when they start explaining who they are and why they're there. We meet numerous mythical creatures as we go down here. This is pointing out that lots of times Dante incorporates mythical creatures as embodiments of the sin they're connected to. So there we get the gluttonous, who are embodied in Cerberus, the three-headed dog that barks incessantly for food. We get the violent top there, who in their violence are like creatures, like the centaurs are. And then the Geryon there, who represents fraud because he has this trusting grandfatherly face, but there's a sting in his tail and a sharp point to his claws. It kind of represents the fact that sinners, this is the corruption. We've become like these monsters. And we ultimately become like Lucifer, who is Lord of this whole region. And here you see a famous pairing, Ugolino and Ruggieri. They both defrauded each other, and Ugolino ended up being locked in a tower with his sons and seemingly might have resorted to cannibalism. And so Ugolino and Ruggieri are locked together for all eternity, with Ugolino gnawing on the skull of Ruggieri. On the right there, that's me after about 3 hours searching, finding the actual tower where Ugolino was locked. I looked really happy, but it was a pretty awful place. But notice they're gnawing on one another. And then when we get to Lucifer in the very center, what do we see him doing? We see him embodying all of the sins that we've encountered so far. We see him with 3 faces, gnawing on 3 sinners. And it calls to mind that passage in Galatians where Paul writes that if you bite and devour each other, watch out or you will be destroyed by each other. Here, Dante and Virgil arrive at, they encounter Lucifer on the night of Holy Saturday, the 24-hour period when Christ was in the tomb, when despair was greatest, and they encounter Lucifer himself. But it's a very non-Miltonian Lucifer, as many people point out. This Lucifer seems to have lost the good of reason himself. He's slobbering, he's crying, he's drooling. He's hardly cognizant of the sinners that he's chomping on. He's got 3 heads because he's a kind of parody of the Trinity that he tried to overthrow. He's flapping his wings constantly as if in an attempt to rise back up to God, but the flapping of those wings locks him in ice for all eternity and keeps hell frozen. And of course, if love represents God and it's represented by fire, the opposite of that is the isolation that happens when you're stuck in the ice. And so hell is frozen over, of course, for Dante, because it represents the antithesis of the love and warmth that we see in the triune God. Dante's point here, I think, is that we should be repulsed by this kind of Lucifer and want nothing to do with him. From here, Dante and Virgil move very quickly through the center of the earth, and they arrive on the outskirts of the world, where they behold the stars and start moving up into Mount Purgatory. Now, if we had a little more time, we could stop here and take some questions, but I'm going to keep rolling along and walk us in a similar way through Mount Purgatory and Paradiso, and we'll do so a little more swiftly as I see time marching on. So here we see Dante again presenting to us Mount Purgatory in the middle. And when we come to Mount Purgatory, here we come to our first encounter with souls who are in the church. For Dante and the medievals, there are three parts to the church. There is the church militant on earth, the church suffering on Mount Purgatory, and the church triumphant in heaven. And he makes that connection certainly between the souls in purgatory, or the Christian souls in purgatory, and the souls on earth, very explicit, because the souls that we meet in purgatory often ask Dante to have the souls on earth pray for them while they pray for the souls on earth. Now, here is a bit of the structure of Mount Purgatory. It's structured according to a kind of Augustinian understanding of love, that the first 3 actual parts of purgatory represent misdirected love, love for the wrong things. The 4th one, a deficient love for the slothful. And then the top 3, excessive love for good things like sex, food, and material possessions. Now, 4 themes also seem to dominate the Purgatorio. Humility. The souls need to adopt a posture of humility so they can make progress in love, moving towards freedom. So very different from the souls that we see in the Inferno. And whereas the Inferno, the further you go down, the more constricting it gets. Purgatorio, the further up you go, the greater the expanse of the sky becomes. This is one of the near the top of Mount Purgatory, and this is one of the penultimate moments of the entire comedy. Here, Virgil speaks to Dante after he has moved through the 7 stories of Mount Purgatory, where he has replaced a vice on each cornice, on each story with its corresponding virtue. And Virgil says this to him. He says, "You have now seen, my son, the temporal and the eternal fire. You've reached the place where my discernment has reached its end. I led you here with skill and intellect. From here on, let your pleasure be your guide. The narrow way, the steep are far below. until those lovely eyes rejoicing come, which is Beatrice, which tearful once urged me to come to you. You may sit here or wander as you please. Expect no longer words or signs from me, for now is your will upright, wholesome, and free, and not to heed its pleasure would be wrong. I crown and mitre you, Lord of yourself. It's this really kind of surprising moment where he says, let pleasure be your guide, which of course is an incredibly dangerous thing to say to somebody unless they have had their loves reordered and have cultivated the virtues such that their pleasure is found in the things that are right. So he says, now, because your will is upright, wholesome, and free, you can follow your pleasure and do what you like. And you no longer need political laws or religious laws, which is the point of crowning and mitering him. Now, we see that move towards freedom from the very beginning when Dante sees a ship of souls coming to Mount Purgatory, singing about Israel's exodus from Egypt. And we see in this fascinating scene that we won't have time for right now, where as soon as that ship lands, Dante meets one of his former friends, a singer named Casella, and Casella sings back some of Dante's own love poetry to Dante, making them delay in their journey up Mount Purgatory, which is the whole point of being on Mount Purgatory, that they would make this kind of progress in reforming and reordering their loves. But it's this really kind of damning moment for Dante where he points out that, my love poetry not only distracted me from making this journey, but also distracted others. And Virgil and Dante, here they are distracted by Dante's own love poetry on the shore of Mount Purgatory from making the journey. So the Roman Cato, who we met at the very base of Purgatory, he runs up and says, what are you doing here? Get on the move. And everybody takes off. And at multiple points in the Purgatorio, we see people say that, as Virgil says here, the more one learns, the more one comes to hate the waste of time. Because these souls are supposed to make progress in reordering their loves. Now, let me dip into a couple more cantos here in this canticle to give you an illustration of how the this entire central piece of the comedy works. He moves through this gate. He has 7 P's carved on his forehead, like all the people in Purgatory do, which represent the 7 deadly sins. And on each cornice, as he moves up, one of those P's is erased, and a weight is lifted from his body. It's like the more we cultivate virtue, the easier it is to become virtuous and to cultivate other virtues. And then he's able to move up the mountain much more swiftly. Now, one of the interesting things, or one of the most fascinating cornices is the very first one where he encounters the proud. And here we get a picture of this structure, the liturgical structure of the entire Purgatorio. And I think we get a clue here as to how Dante wants us to read the entire comedy. Because when he comes to the cornice of the proud, who are trying to become humble, what he sees are images carved into the wall, carved into the floor, that the souls there contemplate for dozens and sometimes hundreds of years, of examples of people who, on the one hand, were humble, or on the other hand, were excessively proud. And what he gives us are images and pictures of stories of people that inform the immoral imaginations of the people who are there, hoping that they come to reject the proud images and move towards the humble ones. It's exactly what Dante gives us in the entire comedy itself, a whole cluster of images and people whose stories, some of whom he wants us to reject and some of whom he wants us to imitate. But the same pattern follows on each of the 7 cornices. He sees an angel, we hear a beatitude, we have a hymn, there's some sort of action that the souls there undergo, which helps them unlearn their particular vice and learn the particular virtue. And then we see examples of each of the virtues, and it's always Mary, the Mother of God, first. Another good example here of something that Dante does throughout, where he uses this form, this kind of pattern, this method called Contrappasso, which means against the passions, where in the Inferno, it's like the punishment fits the particular crime. And here in Mount Purgatory, you see the souls adopting a certain physical activity that helps them cultivate the virtue. So here, the proud have these great weights on their back, which bend them over into the posture of the humble and the penitent. And that takes place on each of the cornices. So let's move on through. Here, more pictures of the folks on each of these cornices moving up. Dante himself goes through, he experiences what the lustful do, kind of acknowledging that, oh yeah, I will spend time here as I will also spend time on the cornice of the proud, he told us earlier. Until we move back to that scene where Virgil crowns and miters him Lord of himself because his loves have been reordered. Then, in a kind of final movement, we finally meet Beatrice, which Dante has been driving towards. And rather than a very happy reunion, Beatrice stands in here for a judgment of God. And we won't read it all, but she chastises him for delaying his journey, for being distracted, for allowing other sirens to distract him, like philosophy and his own love poetry. But then Dante repents, and then Beatrice embodies grace and the forgiveness of God, and she leads Dante through these two streams, Lethe, which helps him forget his sin, and Eunoe, which helps him remember the good deeds that he had done. And in that way, he is prepped and ready to then move into paradise, the very last canticle of this fantastic piece of work. So let me plow on with that, and then we will stop and have some questions and see if I can't go back and fill in some gaps for people. So again, 4 big themes I think we see in Paradiso. I would describe them this way: contentment, conversation, love, and contemplation. Contentment, conversation, love, and contemplation. We see them speeding up. They are light. He has been released from sin. So, and the weight and burden of sin. So he says, we flew up as quick as lightning falls down. And again, a 9-fold structure of paradise patterned after the 7 planets, the sphere of the stars, and then the Empyrean, where the souls of heaven actually are. And each of those spheres, of course, are populated by somebody who identified either with the lack of a particular virtue or the presence of that virtue. And let me make that a little clearer here. Each of the spheres is represented by a planet, and each of those are represented by a certain attribute, and we meet different figures in each of these spheres, like we have both in the Inferno and in the Purgatorio. Now, at the very top, there is this heavenly rose, and this is where all these souls actually sit around God, and they just appear to Dante, as you can kind of see here. They're in the heavenly rose, but they appear to Dante so they can have these conversations with him as he moves through the various spheres of paradise. One of the first people he meets, this is one of the most fascinating scenes in the comedy, I think, and I'll read this exchange with Piccarda Donati, and then we'll move on towards the end. But the first person that he meets in paradise is a woman, probably Dante paying homage to Mary Magdalene, who was the first to see Christ in the post-resurrection state. But of course, the comedy is full of very strong women. This is Piccarda Donati. Piccarda, she died 2 years before the poem took place, so made a rapid ascent into paradise. And she had joined the St. Clares, the Clarisses, who followed St. Francis, but then she was pressured to marry someone and so had to break her vow, but always repented of that need in her heart. And Virgil, here we see this great contrast with the souls in paradise. You can see the underlined passages where Virgil says, Beatrice says, speak to them, listen, trust in what they say, for they are filled with the true light of God that gives them peace and does not let them err. Unlike Francesca, of course, that we met, the woman that we meet back in the Inferno. And one of the questions that Dante asks is, oh, you're in a lower part of heaven. Doesn't that bother you? And she, as you see here in the underlined passage, Piccarda kind of smiles at him, but she gives us a window into all the souls in heaven, how they experience heaven, no matter where they are in the various spheres. And she says, as it says, she gently smiled. She says, let's see, brother, the virtue of our heavenly love quiets our wills and makes us long for no more than what we have. If we desire to be higher up, then our desires would not be in accord with his will. She's aligning her will with God, who assigns us to this sphere. Down below, she says, indeed, the essence of this blessed state is to dwell here within his holy will, so that there is no will but one with his. In his will is our peace. And Dante says, then it was clear to me that everywhere of heaven is paradise. It's as if Piccarda said, I couldn't take anymore. This is the place that was assigned to me, and this is where God wants me to be. And, I am as full as I can be of God's presence and the delight and joy of being with God. And so, no, I'm entirely content to be here. As he moves through the other spheres. This is one of my favorites, the sphere of the theologian, these people that I like to hang out with. One of the things he shows us is that theologians who went hammer and tongs in theological battles on the earth are here together in heaven, and he calls them, they dance together like dancing ladies. It's this beautiful picture of harmony in heaven, even though there wasn't always harmony on earth between some of these saints and theologians and monastic communities. Now, he goes to see St. Peter and St. Paul and St. John, who interview him on faith, hope, and love. And the encounter with Peter is really interesting, and we won't spend any time on this, but I'll just highlight it for you. Here, he has Dante explain Dante's own loves and why Dante came to love God. And Dante picks up the theme that I mentioned in the very beginning and that Charles Williams brings out, the affirmation of all things to the glory of God. Because in this wonderful passage, Dante says, oh, no matter where I find good, it's just a reflection of the goodness of God. And anywhere that I find good reflected, as he calls it, on any leaf in the eternal garden, it makes me come to love the eternal gardener and the whole, and makes me realize that, yes, all of these good things and true things and beautiful things, they're just reflections of the source, which is God himself, no matter where I find them in the world. In a way, it's a kind of justification for what Dante does and for this way of being that Charles Williams draws our attention to. And from there, he moves up and he sees more of the saints in heaven, and we move into this heavenly rows and we figure out who sits where. It's like a giant stadium, and all the souls of the blessed are here around the triune God. And at the very end, St. Bernard comes in. Dante stops looking at Beatrice and he looks at God himself, and he says this: as I learned to see more and the power of vision grew in me, that single aspect as I changed seemed to me to change. Within its depthless clarity of substance, I saw the great light shine into three circles in three clear colors bound in the one same space. The first seemed to reflect the next like rainbow on rainbow, and the third was like a flame. This is the Holy Spirit, equally breathed forth by the other two, seemed in itself and in its own color to be depicted with man's very image. Obviously trying to show here the incarnation in the triune God that has so captured him. And he says, at this point, power failed high fantasy. He admits he's undone. He has no more words to describe it, even though he's one of the greatest poets. But like wheels in perfect balance turning, I felt my will and my desire impelled by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. And from there, the poem ends. And Dante has experienced, even momentarily, what the other saints in heaven have experienced when his will, his intellect, and his affections have come into harmony with the triune God of love. And the poem ends there. And of course, we hope, and Dante hopes, that he will go back to Purgatory and Paradiso once he actually passes away. So let me stop sharing my screen. And thanks for everybody's patience as we went through that and pressed on the time, I know. But I'm trying to give you a scope of the whole and enough of the individual parts so that when you read it for yourself, you kind of understand how Dante's mind works and how this wonderful work of poetry actually transpires.
Dr. Williams, you are amazing, sir. Thank you so much. And that was even at times kind of funny. I was laughing here, enjoying the way that you could comment. I want to make an introduction here to Stephanie Beatty. Stephanie is the Chief Academic Officer here at CLT. And what we're going to do now is just kind of a few minutes of just kind of open Q&A. And then I think also we'd love to hear a bit more about your work at the Honors College, Templeton Honors College at Eastern University. So I will pass it over to Stephanie to kind of moderate that conversation. So I think we've already got some great questions in the chat and the Q&A from teachers and from students.
Yeah, definitely. And so, Dr. Williams, one of the questions we got from Kate M, if someone wanted to understand Dante's theological perspectives in his creation of Purgatorio, what authors would they need to read and study?
Yeah, I mean, really for Dante, the two theologians are Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. Now, saying that, unfortunately, they wrote shelves and shelves of books. So, I think there are probably, but those are the two that I would turn to, St. Augustine and St. Thomas. If you find St. Thomas is great because it's pretty easy to find him on specific topics. So you could look at his comments on on the idea of purgatory. But this is why C.S. Lewis believed in purgatory, and the same reason that Dante, I think, did in the medieval tradition. For Lewis and for Dante, it's hard for them to imagine being ushered into the presence of God as the sinners that they are. So there's this sense that the formation that we began on earth just continues by God's grace through Mount Purgatory, readying us for heaven. So one caveat I would say is that even if you think, okay, theologically, I'm not sure I see the logic of purgatory, that's fine, because purgatory, I think that's the canticle of the three that we should most identify with. Because in a way, those of us who are Christians, we are undergoing the same kind of formation in virtue and reordering our loves that the souls in Mount Purgatory are going through. So I think Dante lived in a medieval Catholic world where everybody was Catholic, and it made sense to him, and there were no objections to it, really. But I think even for us now, purgatory, those are the souls where we can really see ourselves reflected. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Great. And we have another question from Noor S, and that is, what does a non-believer, as Beckett and Joyce, for example, take from Dante?
What does a non-believer take from Dante?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the same thing that a believer takes from a pagan poet or any pagan author. I mean, this is really one of the greatest works ever created by a human person. So it's an unbelievable work of poetry, an unbelievable work of beauty and of structure and depth and clarity. And, I mean, it depends on what kind of non-believer you are, because Dante here is obviously riffing like Aquinas does on so much of Aristotle. Aristotle is the master of those who know for Dante when he writes about Aristotle in Limbo. And so there's all kinds of insight into the human condition, wisdom into human well-being, woven all through this story, whether you believe any of it or not. And you can read the comedy on multiple levels. You can read it for, as I do, as a work of moral formation. You can read it for all his political references. You can read it as a work of political philosophy. You could read it as a work about poetry, and lots of people do. And so there are multiple ways to read this work. So one certainly doesn't have to be a believer and to benefit from this work, or to enjoy it as an incredible work of art.
And then a question from Angelina G during the presentation: why is the betrayal of guests further down the circle than the betrayal of family? Wouldn't the betrayal of your family be more significant than betrayal of a guest?
Yeah, well, it's partly because you have welcomed the guest into your home and said, I will take care of you. And so the guest puts themselves in a vulnerable position by, laying down their arms, and they sleep in your bed and you feed them. And so they have made themselves vulnerable to you. And lots of times the guests, in the ancient or medieval world, this is why xenia, or the practice of hospitality, was so important in the Odyssey. Guests, it's not like they have hotels to stay in. It's not like you can stay in, book something on Airbnb. Guests were often travelers, were often in a vulnerable position. And when they come into your home, they are trusting you for their material well-being. So when you deceive them, when you poison them, when you slit their throat in the middle of the night and take their stuff, it represents a more heinous form of fraud than betraying a family member who might not have made themselves vulnerable to you in exactly the same way that a guest would have. I think that's right. I could answer that a dozen different ways, but I think that's the way to say it.
And so we still have a couple more questions about Dante. We're short on time, so I don't know. Do you want to finish those out? Do you want to move to talking about Templeton?
No, let's talk about Dante.
All right.
We'll talk about Templeton in a second, but let's throw a couple other questions out.
So Skylar C asked, what translation of the comedy and other works about Dante do you recommend?
Sure. Translations of the comedy are like translations of the New Testament, right? Which one's best? Oh, well, there's about a dozen that are pretty decent. And so ones I like Mark Musa. I think his is really good. I used it to teach high school for a long time. It also comes in the portable Penguin edition, so it's easy and cheap. Anthony Esselin has a new translation out that is really, really good. Mandelbaum is the translation that I used when I was first digging into it. And so that is a favorite of lots of people. So I would try one of those three: Mark Musa, Anthony Esselin, or I'm just blanking on Mandelbaum's first name. Sorry to the Mandelbaum family. Those are three great translations you can't go wrong with.
Great.
Alan, thank you. Alan Mandelbaum. Thank you, Kristen Rudd.
Samuel G said, of all the authors, philosophers, and poets of the ancient world, why did Dante select Virgil to be the first guide?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. That needs a much longer answer than I'm going to be able to give it. But really, Virgil was, in part because I think Dante knew Latin and didn't know Greek. But you think your options really are, Homer and Virgil. And Virgil wrote about the founding of Rome, and Rome is where the church was born. And Virgil had this fourth eclogue, which predicted the coming of Christ. And Dante is on the Italian peninsula there as a Florentine. And he had been instructed really in how to become a poet through Virgil, through reading Virgil. And so I think Virgil, not Homer, was his poetic master. That's who he studied, and that's who he was not only inspired by, but really learned the poetic craft from. So I think there are a number of reasons why Virgil makes sense to be the poet that Dante chose to guide. And, in the Aeneid, Aeneas himself goes into Hades. And so it was almost like Virgil had been there before. And Virgil, when he guides Dante through the Inferno, it's clear Virgil knows his way around. There are a couple of things that surprise him, but for the most part, he already knows his way around there. And so, yeah, I think there are probably a dozen different reasons, but I think that's a handful of them why he chose our man Virgil.
Deborah A asks, could you comment on the mathematical/geometric structure that is apparent in the work, and what are we to make of this?
Well, I don't know exactly what you're referring to in the mathematical or the geometrical structure. What I will say, and maybe this is what you're asking, I'm not sure. I had a couple slides on this that I took out just for the sake of time. But the entire structure, the entire poem is structured according to 3s and 6s and 9s. Maybe that's what you're referring to. So every 3 lines are a group called a tercet. And every line has 11 syllables in it. So every tercet has 33 syllables. And every sentence in the entire comedy is either three, 6, or 9 lines long. And threes are just woven throughout the entire thing, 3s, 6s, and 9s, but especially threes. So, I mean, the structure, this is where I get, it's almost frightening what Dante does in the comedy. I mean, I'll be honest, like I don't know how a human mind did this. But for him, it's witnessing to or evidencing the fact that the triune God permeates all of the cosmos. So the triune God represented by 3, there's nowhere in the cosmos that the triune God is not present for Dante. And so in the very structure of his poem, he weaves these 3s and 6s and 9s all the way through as a kind of homage or as a kind of a testimony to that. That's probably what I would say as far as like the mathematical structure. There's probably more that could be said, but let me leave it there for now.
Great. And then one more. So Kimberly asked,
Yep.
At what point did Dante gain acclaim for his work?
Did he gain acclaim? Oh, acclaim. Oh, I see. Acclaim. Yeah, very shortly after. Yeah, it was very, very early. When he was in Ravenna, his biographer Boccaccio refers to, he says that Dante was known as the man who had been to hell and back, or could go to hell at his whim. And so the work became very widely known very quickly. The first commentary on the comedy shows up within, I think, 70 to 80 years of Dante dying, and you start seeing illustrated manuscripts of it very quickly. And so, unlike a lot of authors and artists, Dante's genius was pretty quickly recognized. Now, worth noting, this wasn't the first and only thing that he wrote. He wrote other works of poetry. He wrote a work of political philosophy. He had some fairly significant friends, some important friends. And so he was well known, not only for his politics, but also as an author already. But as far as the comedy goes, yes, it was very, very quickly recognized to be a work of, incomparable genius.
Great. So I think now we should move on to talking about Templeton a little bit. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. In the meantime, Dr. Williams, while we're waiting for that, do you just want to give a little bit more information about Templeton and any additional programs that you have? Yeah,
sure. I'd love to. So just a quick word about what we do in the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University. Eastern University is right outside Philadelphia in a beautiful part of the historic part of the country, a few miles from Valley Forge. The Templeton Honors College is an honors college within Eastern, like I said, and we have 3 programs. We have a program for high school students. We have a program for undergraduate students, and we have an MA program in classical education and teaching for teachers who are in classical charter and classical private schools. The high school program is called our Summer Scholars Program. We run this every summer, and we have certain weeks set aside where we run classes for high school students, where they come to our campus. They have classes with our faculty. They spend a week with our upperclassmen, and then they earn college credit for those classes. And we run classes, for instance, in the moral vision of C.S. Lewis. We run a class on Tolkien and Christian fantasy literature. We ran a class this last summer called Coding with the Ancients, where we took our liberal arts professors and our mathematics department professors, and we had conversations about the ethics of technology and mechanization, while we also taught students how to code and use Raspberry Pi and these kinds of things. We had a wonderful class also called American Revolutions that we run sometimes on the American Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement, where we take students out to Gettysburg for seminars. We take them down to Constitution Hall for seminars. We take them to Valley Forge for seminars, and where we really go to the places where America was born, and we read some of the primary texts. So we run these courses 2 or 3 every summer, and it's a great way for students, certainly who are homeschool students, to come together with other students from around the country, where what always happens is, you put them in a room together and they start talking and they realize, oh, you love the same things I do. I thought I was the only one. It's that great description that C.S. Lewis gives us of friendship in the 4 loves. We see that over and over and over again. And we have such a great time with our summer scholars program. So that's one that I would emphasize to people who are taking CLT, or if you're teachers with high school students, have them check out the summer scholars program. And it's a great way to spend a week. It's a great introduction to what we do in Templeton, and it's a great way to spend time with some of our upperclassmen and faculty and check out Eastern University. The undergrad program, if you are graduating or are moving that direction, the undergraduate honors college program is a great books program that fulfills a student's general education requirements. So any university you go to, you have to do 40 to 42 general ed or gen ed requirements before you go on to your other degree. The way we've structured it is that our integrated curriculum in Great Books satisfies the general education requirements, leaving all of our undergrad students to major in something else outside of the honors college. So our students major in math, in engineering, in computer science, in nursing, in history, in biochem, in pre-med. All the while, they are reading the great books together as a cohort in small groups with our really quite distinguished faculty in the Honors College. So that's a really wonderful program. So if you want to keep studying great books, but you don't want to just do a major in great books, or you have other interests or want to get a degree in mechanical engineering or cybersecurity, the Templeton Honors College at Eastern is a great way to do that. Where you can major in something else while you also read the great books and explore great art and music, etc. As Jeremy said, we start our undergrad year with a week up in the Adirondack Mountains with all of our honors college freshmen, where we hike and canoe in all of our gear. And we begin our semester by a mountain lake. And we began reading the Odyssey together out in the woods. And we have sessions on how to have a conversation and just really orienting people as a cohort to the kind of education that we provide. Then for the last 3 years, we have a great MA program in classical ed and teaching. So if you're a teacher on here and you're teaching in a classical school and you want to dig in a little deeper, or you want to take some time where you are able to think about classical education and your own pedagogy and the history, you should check out our MAT program, which is a Master of Arts in Classical Teaching. And there we have classes on classical pedagogy, the history of classical education. We have classes on difference in human dignity, on special needs in classical education. We have a brand new class on classical education and the Black intellectual tradition. And so those classes are both on ground and online. We run in summer intensives, and we have then online classes in both the summer and the school year. So those are a quick look at our 3 programs in the Templeton Honors College.
Great. And Skylar C asks, what does Templeton have for a literature major?
Right. So it's a great fit for lit majors, because you can come to Templeton as an undergrad student and you can do our sequence of 13 classes, 13 integrated classes, which are rich in literature and philosophy and theology and history, while you also do a BA or a bachelor's degree in literature in our English department. So you can have the kind of best of both of those there, and you can learn, you can pursue your specialty in whatever way you want in the English or lit department, while you're also getting this broad-based classical education in the Honors College. I happen to be the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities as well. So the English faculty are under me as well as the Honors College. And so I'm working to do more and more integration between all of those. But it's a great fit for somebody who wants to be a lit major.
Great. And then the 3 programs that you mentioned, if someone was interested in one of those, will you be following up with more information about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what's the best way. Why don't I quickly put our web address into the chat, if that works. And let's see. There's our web address. And on that, you can look at great kind of intro videos that we have. And let me send a link as well to the Summer Scholars Program, which would be especially relevant to any high school students on here, or any teachers who have high school students looking for something to do in the summer. Coming to Philly and hanging out with us is a good way to spend 7 or 8 days reading some great books and having some great conversations.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Williams. This was fantastic. We're so glad that we had you to kick off the journey through the Author Bank series. I'll put a link in the chat. If you haven't signed up for the mailing list, please do so. There will be a recording of this in that mailing list. We'll send out an email about that. And that's also the best place to sign up for new Zoom webinars for this series. So thank you again. Really glad to have you, and we're looking forward to the next.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for everyone that showed up. That was super fun.